A compendium of the Bible, a study of the book of Habakkuk. The prophet's book takes its name from the author, possibly mean one who embraces. Chapter 1, verse 1, chapter 3, verse 1. By the end of the prophecy, his name becomes appropriate as the prophet clings to God regardless of his confusion about God's plan for his people. As with many of the minor prophets, nothing is known about the prophets except that which can be referred from the book. In the case of Habakkuk, internal information is virtually non existent, making conclusions about his identity and life conjecture. His simple introduction as the prophet Habakkuk might imply that he need no introduction since he was a well-known prophet of his day. It is certain that he was a contemporary of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and Zephaniah. The opening verse reveals a historical situation similar to the days of Amos, Micah. Justice had essentially disappeared from the land. Violence and wickedness were pervasive, existing unchecked. In the midst of these dark days, the prophet cried out for divine intervention. Chapter 1, verse 2 and 4. God's respond that he was sending the Chaldean to judge Judah. Chapter 1, verse 5 through 11, creates an even greater theological dilemma for Habakkuk. Why didn't God purge his people and restore their righteousness? How could God use the Chaldeans to judge a people more righteous than they? Chapter 1, verse 12 through chapter 2, verse 1. God's answer that he would judge the Chaldeans also, in chapter 2, verses 2 through 20, did not fully satisfy the prophet's theological question, nor did he leave the question unanswered. The fact only intensified. In Habakkuk's mind, the issue crying for resolution is no longer God's righteous response toward evil, or lack thereof, but the vindication of God's character and covenant with his people. Chapter 1, verse 13. Like Job, the prophet argued with God, and through that experience, he achieved a deeper understanding of God's sovereignty, character, and a firmer faith in him. Job 42, 5 and 6, Isaiah 55, 8 and 9. Ultimately, Habakkuk realized that God was not to be worshipped merely because of the temporal blessings he bestowed, but for his own sake, found in chapter 3, verse 17 through 15. The book of Habakkuk is divided into three parts. Superscription, chapter 1, verse 1, the prophet's perplexity, chapter 1, verse 2 through chapter 2, verse 20. His first complaint, chapter 1, verse 2 through 4, God's first response, chapter 1, verse 5 through 11. His second complaint, chapter 1, verse 12 through chapter 2, verse 1, God's second response, chapter 2, verse 2 through 20. And finally, the prophet's prayer, chapter 3, verse 1 through 19. Petition for God's mercy, chapter 3, verse 1 and 2. Praise of God's power, chapter 3, verse 3 through 15. Promise of God's sufficiency, chapter 3, verse 16 through 19. Thus concludes the study of the book of Habakkuk.